Wow, seriously, no sound. Thank you, Cyber Ninja Zero. Let's start all over again. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Episode 26 of the Grindset stream. Episode 26 of Escaping the Moldbug Matrix. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and Telegram. Don't forget to support me on Local, Subscribe Star, and Buy Me a Coffee. And don't forget to check out my Substack, where you can read me saying things that can't really be said on YouTube. Within the next couple of weeks, hopefully, Logos and I will finish the first year of Unqualified Reservations, the year 2007. So then there'll be a bonus episode where we sort of like summarize as a TLDR the last, 50-odd hours of content we've had reading Unqualified Reservations. So if you're late to the series or don't want to watch all the other videos, stay tuned for 2007 Unqualified Reservation in Review. I just heard from Logos privately. He'll be here shortly. He's been delayed on his end just a little bit. So hopefully when we, by the time we finish up the Iglesias article, he'll be back. So without further ado, we will pick up where we left off last week. But we have a further puzzle to unravel. After all, if I, whose closest connection to the Pentagon is that I can get my car insurance from USAA, can understand these things, how can they be lost on the Pentagon itself? Wasn't that True Inquirer book hosted on a Pentagon site? The answer is the Pentagon is tactically right to do everything it can to avoid collateral damage. Moreover, its enemies are tactically right to do everything they can try to trick the Pentagon into causing collateral damage via the... Whoa! Stop the presses, guys. Now let's go back to just a couple of months ago when Moldbug was on Orrin McIntyre. And he said that provoking a response from those in power by DeSantis and company while being the weaker party was a mistake. Well, no, it's not from a guerrilla point of view, and Moldbug knows it. Moreover, its enemies, the terrorists, are tactically right to do everything they can do to trick the Pentagon into causing collateral damage. Well, that's exactly, how do we know that's not exactly what someone like DeSantis is trying to do? So there's a little bit of a reasoning for this. If we go back, say, 10 years, when people on the right, specifically people like Glenn Beck and others, started hearing about the sort of tactics that the left was using with these sort of, shock, avant-garde strategies, labor organizing strategies. And that was around the time of Barack Obama, because Barack Obama was a community organizer. They started to implement those same tactics on their own. No, they didn't happen overnight. And arguably could say Donald Trump did it better than even the normies did. But you could argue that they have been reading these kinds of community organizing works that influenced the likes of Barack Obama and have been, I think it was called Patriot, no, not Patriot Front's a far-right group. It was something Patriots that Glenn Beck was supporting of in this regard. And it's only, gone beyond that with Donald Trump and so on. So okay, when it comes to an insurgency movement, which is what, back to the Elves versus Hobbits article is, back to his interview with Orrin McIntyre, he says that the right is in. It is in the interest of the weaker party to provoke a reaction from the stronger party, as I said with the review with Logos. So we know that Moldbug is being dishonest because he admits right here that it's in the interest of the insurgents to cause the stronger power to react to cause collateral damage. Moving on. But the reason that human shields work has nothing to do with winning hearts. In fact, the very existence of human shields completely negates the winning hearts hypothesis because it's obvious that anyone hurt while serving, by definition, involuntarily as a human shield, will blame whoever put him in the way of the bomb, not whoever dropped it. Well, that's like the stupidest thing I ever heard. I mean, there are plenty of people that in Iraq and Afghanistan at the time of him writing this in 2007 who were voluntarily signing up to be a suicide bomber because they believed you would open them to the doors of paradise. So this is nonsense. Of course they knew. Of course they did it voluntarily. They were literally suicide bombers. Or maybe, as often was the case, you would offer some poor Iraqi or poor Afghan money to blow himself up such that would be enough money for him to give his family as a way to provide for his family. He must be in a desperate situation to want to do that. But according to Moldbug, the libertarian, that's an ex ante transaction of money between two people that know what they're doing. So, clearly it's a voluntary transaction here, guys. In fact, winning hearts is crack, pure and simple. As Trinquirer points out, every successful liberation movement in the 20th century has terrorized the population into submission. Even Pentagon attacks on civilians in South Vietnam with far more liberal rules of engagement than apply today in Iraq were generally accidental. Logos is here. Hello, Logos.
Hey, how's it going?
So good. Everybody, we're just going to back up real quick. I want you to read this, Logos, right here. You see something here?
No.
So do you remember when we did the review of Warren McIntyre's interview of Moldbug? Okay, remember? And Moldbug said that DeSantis should not provoke the stronger power because he's not strong enough to win.
Yeah, got it.
Okay, what is this? What is this? Right here, highlighted right there.
There you go. Moral, yeah. Now I see what you're going for.
Moldbug is full of shit. Like, he knows that would work. He knows that would work, and that's why he's telling DeSantis and company not to do it.
I mean, I can give him some kind of a charitable steel man in the sense that foreign countries can have the backing of our media institutions, and so they want to trick the Pentagon into providing extra collateral damage because they know the media will crucify them for it. But when it comes to right-wingers, there's nothing the media won't justify having been done to their opponents, and so the reasoning might be a little different.
Well, yes, but we see that it's actually working, though, right? Because with the, as you've been following on Twitter, with the overall normie American reaction to the trans movement, it to all appearances looks like to me that liberals and center-left types are balking at this and being labeled right-wing and by de facto being put in the camp with DeSantis.
Right.
So it looks like it is working.
Yeah, that's obviously why I disagree with Moldbug, but
right. No, but you see, I literally everything in 2007 Logos is everything you're going to need to know about Moldbug now. Like, he didn't change at all.
Yeah, probably.
All right. Okay. Even Pentagon attacks on civilians in South Vietnam with far more liberal rules of engagement than apply today in Iraq were generally accidental and uncoordinated, whereas massacring the civilian opponents was standard procedure for the VC. Explaining that Americans need to win hearts and minds because they are white imperialists, whereas Taliban or Viet Cong or FLN guerrillas can cut them down and eat them because they're swarthy indigenous peoples, requires falling back on hoary nationalist cliches that really shouldn't require an answer. Okay, now I'm gonna argue that while I would agree with Moldbug that the communists were extremely brutal and the Viet Cong did terrorize indigenous, Vietnamese. I don't know. I get the feeling that the Taliban just had more broad-based support anyhow. I mean, look at how quickly they retook Afghanistan once the U.S. pulled out.
Yep.
So I don't think they had to rule through terror in the same way that the Viet Cong did.
Exactly.
They seemed to, because they represented their religious authorities, right? The Taliban themselves were refugees from the Soviet invasion who were educated in Islamic schools, madrasas in Pakistan. So they already had a level of legitimacy that the VC didn't have. Okay, I'm sorry, people, if you genuinely believe it is unnatural and impossible for a foreign military occupation to become a stable government and eventually an ethnically distinct ruling caste. You know more about human history than a cat knows about tennis. Go read about, say, India sometime. So the puzzle remains, why worry about civilian casualties? Isn't collateral damage just the Air Force's way of telling you not to hang out with the blast radius of insurgents? Didn't we do a lot of collateral damage to Germany and Japan? And what are their insurgents? The answer, which Trinquirer would certainly have understood, although it would have appalled him and struck him as disastrous, is that the Pentagon does suffer as a result of civilian casualties, because any such event strengthens the Pentagon's true enemies, who tend to live not in Kabul, but in Bethesda or Silver Spring or maybe Manhattan. Furthermore, of all of the Pentagon's adversaries in recent years have understood that the most effective strategy is to defeat the Pentagon politically, not militarily. Clausels would be proud, but of course the two are the same thing. And finally, the ugliest trope of all is that everyone on the battlefield Pentagon soldiers, their native adversaries, journalists, and even the local civilians whose support is so crucial understand this perfectly. It's war, after all. If you're involved in war, you understand it. The result is that even local civilians see civilian casualties as a point scored for the insurgents. So human shield tactics, which cannot possibly do anything to win hearts, are winners nonetheless. Every time a human shield gets fragged and the fact gets to the press, Pentagon's chances of winning decrease. Every time the Pentagon's chances of winning decrease, the insurgents' chances of winning increase. Every time the insurgents' chances of winning increase, rational civilians have more motivation to join the insurgency. I assure you that although this seems complicated to you, it is not at all complicated to those in a war zone. Moreover, human instincts for collective action are deeply rooted. Even chimpanzees have tribes which fight wars. And the human ability to construct a moral rationale for the decision to side with the strong horse is always impressive. In other words, martyrs are martyrs, even if someone forced them to be martyrs. As long as martyrdom is a militarily effective strategy, we will continue to see more of it. One way to see this is to look at the insurgent or terrorist movements which have no possibility of gaining the support of Western human rights activists. A good example is the OAS in Algeria, founded by the colleagues of Trinquire, who knew exactly how to run an insurgency and had a substantial local support base. It went nowhere because if it only alienated its supporters in France. The fate of the AWB in South Africa is even more pathetic. It had no foreign sponsors at all. Insurgency simply does not work without political protection. If this analysis is correct, these third world insurgents wars exist only because of Western human rights activism. So why don't Western human rights activists recognize this? Why don't they notice that they are creating violence and destruction rather than suppressing it? Okay, I'm gonna make a point here, and I wanted to see what you have to say about this, Logos. So let's go back to DeSantis and dissident Americans, the hobbits. Let's say they do this, and Moldbug will be like, well, it's not going to work, guys, because you don't have the support. Well, here's the thing, though. He's assuming that this is still the Cold War, where China and Russia represent the left. But China and Russia today represent the right globally because America represents the left. So might not they serve the financial role that Western human rights groups did for revolutionaries in the 60s and 70s?
I have no idea. What?
Well, you don't. You want me to repeat it?
That was a lot in that question. I'm trying to figure out which part I should try to answer first. Yeah, repeat it. Let's take this one little chunk at a time.
Okay, so people like DeSantis on the right, because he's writing this article to say that the right can't do this because it needs funding from the outside. And right. The funding on the outside, he's pointing to all these Cold War examples, which was coming from Russia and China and Western liberals.
Yes.
Okay. He's saying that at the right, you can't do that. Well, yeah, you couldn't do that during the Cold War. But in the post-Cold War era, Russia and China represent the right because America represents the left. And so might not such a move work now, given that China and Russia would spend money on it?
Yes. What is the move exactly? Sorry, that's the part I'm missing. What move were we talking about?
The whole thing, this sort of this insurgency.
Oh, okay.
A right-wing insurgency, Moldbug says, can't work because it doesn't have the support and external financial support. But that's not true now.
Well, it's complicated. So if you look at like the world politics, you're right. The U.S. is seen as like the de facto left when it comes to geopolitical politics. And that's letting the U.S. get away with a lot more stuff they didn't used to get away with back when. For example, how many lefties know that we've just signed an order putting boots on the ground in Sudan? I just heard about that on Twitter recently. Nobody on the left's going to talk about that. Because the U.S. is the de facto left, they can ramp up and do a lot more warlike things they never would have been able to do, I don't know, in the 60s and 70s. And their opponents are going to get away with less and less and less. I mean, look at how much of an eye is on Russia and Ukraine and so on and so forth. Now, imagine that kind of one-sided treatment, in favor of the U.S. government attacking a right-wing insurgency. I mean, if the U.S. government just put, I don't know, military boots on the ground in Texas or something to fight them over some border thing, the press is probably just not going to talk about it. I mean, if the same global trends apply, and so because the government is the left. And so I just don't know. It could work, but I don't know. This is, yeah.
Well, then the follow-up thing that I would say is the reason why we haven't had a second Waco is because everybody knows if we do, that's a civil war between the American right and the government.
Yes. Oh, that's definitely true.
And so if you're saying, Logos, that they could just take the gloves off and the media wouldn't cover it, that's true. But it also doesn't matter when it comes to geopolitics, because the people who make the decision know that if they do that, that's going to be a full-scale civil war in the United States simultaneously while they're fighting Russia and China.
Yeah.
I mean, are they going to really do that?
Yeah, that's the new dimension. That's the new dimension that makes this interesting, that Moldbug I don't think is thinking about much, is the fact that it's no longer WashCorp, as he'd call it, protecting its own sovereignty against internal threats, putting the full might of its steel-toed boot on the opposition. Now it's trying to deal with a whole bunch of other threats around the world, and then trying to deal with the people fighting them on the inside. I don't think it could fight the war on all fronts.
Well, it couldn't. And even as the time of him writing this in 2007, the lessons of Waco had been learned, which is why even without an obvious threat from Russia or China, the United States was not willing to risk another Waco.
Yeah.
Even under the optimal conditions Moldbug is writing under from WashCorp's perspective.
Yeah, that's true. I also think that back in 2007, the left hadn't fully captured the media in the same way they've done today. For example, in the early 2000s, Rachel Maddow, for example, I think she was still doing her radio show. Was it like Air America or something like that? She hadn't yet been on MSNBC. The CNN was, ostensibly a bit more central than current times, where it had, just fired, thank goodness, Don Lemon. But, the idea of like this ranting, mostly peaceful protesters with cars burning in the background thing, and people would never thought about that in 2007. There's no way. So, the media just, the government just didn't have the media brought to heel in the same way in 2007 that it does now.
True. But you see, that's a double-edged sword, right? Because when Mean Mr. Mustache in the middle of the 20th century invaded all those countries, nobody at home thought Germany was losing until it was too late.
Yes, absolutely.
So it's a double-edged sword.
It is.
If this analysis is correct, these third world insurgent, I read that. A simple explanation of the phenomena is that Western human rights activists are in fact political activists seeking power by the only means that are available to them. It is not that opposing the Pentagon is a necessary method of their human rights activism. It is that their human rights activism is a necessary method of their opposing the Pentagon. The U.S. military is as necessary to these people as drugs are to anti-drug warriors. Thus, it is... Well, that's just clearly not true given the current paradigm we have now.
Yeah.
All these human rights activists are now, waving army flags. It's not true.
Yep.
Thus, it is inconceivable that they would conclude that the best way to end the war in Iraq is for the U.S. to impose martial law. Is it? We're out of Iraq now, but I think these people today might support that. If you could couch imposing martial law as protecting women from mean theocratic fascists who want to put the burqa back on.
Absolutely, yeah.
They would totally support that. Dismiss the Iraqi government and suspend all civil liberties. We saw exactly how much Western human rights activists cared about their swarthy mascots in the 70s when they finally managed to force South Vietnam to surrender to the North. Tens of thousands of Vietnamese were shot, murdered, and hundreds of thousands imprisoned without trial, and millions fled on boats. These watchdogs of humanity uttered not even a meow. I'm sure most of these peace protesters of the 1960s sincerely believed that they loved their little brown brothers, but the real political motor of their movement was their hatred of their American enemies and their desire to achieve power by defeating them. Same old, same old. Now, what's truly amazing about these liberators is their assiduous avoidance of every technique of governing foreign populations that might actually possibly work. This is because all of these new techniques are practiced under colonialism, and we know colonialism is bad because we heard it in school. Well, okay, here's the problem, right? One, given that we know now these same, human rights activists would totally support draconian, what did we say last week? He said Moldbug wanted fascist corporate control. Yeah, they totally support that if you just use the right buzzwords.
Yes.
The reason why this sort of like old school colonial hardassery is out of favor is the same reason the Soviet Union fell. It doesn't really work. As Huxley said in his interview with George Wallace, you can do anything with a bayonet but sit on it. How do you go to bed at night, have wine with your dinner and not be afraid of a revolution? Well, if you use more subtle means of social control through things like drugs and the media and propaganda, the very things that Huxley talks about.
Yeah.
It's just more, up to a point, it was just more efficient to do it that way. And that's why it was done that way. Now, we might be in a period of transition where it's less efficient, but it's, there's other reasons, is what I'm saying. For example, the Pentagon may not dissolve the corrupt, murderous, and dangerously ineffective democratic government it has installed in Iraq. It may not declare that democracy has failed in Iraq and hand over the place over to a Hashemite, Saudi, or other Gulf prince, or even better, split it into UAE like Emirates, because that would be just two British Empire. That's a really idiotic thing to say, since it was the British Empire that put Iraq together as three different ethnic groups. For example, the Pentagon may not understand any circumstances create hybrid organizations, military or political, in which the leaders are foreign and frontline employees are native. Britain governed half the world at a cost which was negligible compared to the Iraq Bill. By creating military forces with British officers and native troops, to call this a no-brainer would be insult to the brainless. Yet it has not been done, nor could anything like it be done. Similarly, it is absolutely verboten to create an Iraqi government run by foreign executives with Iraqi personnel. That would be colonialism, and colonialism is wrong. In fact, to the extent that the Pentagon has achieved any success in Iraq, it has been the almost accidental success of the awakening movement. It is very unclear whose idea that this was, although it may be traced to the late Captain Travis Partuquin. It certainly did not come from Washington, and its inspiration may well owe as much to Iraqis as Americans. And most important, it's a stone-cold ripoff of a classic colonialist technique. It worked immediately as soon as it was tried. Basically, indirect role was to the Iraq war as penicillin was to gangrene. Unfortunately, because it is the only such technique the Pentagon is allowed to use, I suspect it will prove fruitless in the end. But whose fault is that? It's yours, my dear progressive friends, my lovers of humanity everywhere. So here is my short proposal for a successful occupation of Iran. Invade Iran, impose martial law, declare Iran a United States territory, use the Philippines as a model, disband all Iranian military forces and government structures, create a new military and government with Western officers and managers, profit. Is this bizarre? I'm sure Iglesias would find it bizarre. I'm the Lord Cromer who would find it perfectly normal and sensible. One of these two gentlemen is on crack, surely, and it's a pity the other is not with us to make his case. If we can summarize this hellacious strain of crack in one sentence, it might come down to the declaration that a people can only be stably, peacefully, and lawfully governed with their own consent. Note the complete meaninglessness and, in fact, ungrammatical nature of the word a people. What defines a set of individuals as a people? Are all the people whose names start with M a people? Where is my president of M? Or should we use geographic boundaries and birth coordinates? Or linguistic boundaries? But what makes either of these divisions meaningful? And we haven't even gotten into the definition of consent. Well, for all of this, chin scratching of what is a border, what is a people, if Arabs crossed in from the West Bank into Israel, all of a sudden that border would become very real to Moldbug.
Yes.
All of a sudden, oh no, we're not just a bunch of random individual people living in this piece of land without any borders. We're being invaded by Islamic terrorists. Remember, this statement is firmly within the boundaries of Hume's is. It is not a moral assertion. It is a statement of military reality, or rather, it would be a statement of military reality if it wasn't 100% pure Indian high-test blue powder crack that it is. So here's a question for the reader. What does this brand of crack have to do with some poor woman in South Africa whose face is hopefully starting to resemble a face again, if anything? And if the answer is anything, can we associate this crime, which is certainly not a crime or even unusual, with Iglesias and his smug ilk, just as we associate the big H with the NS? What a prejudice this would be, and would it be a good one or a bad one? Having finished this mess, what is even the point, Logos? Like, the war on terror was a complete disaster. Is he arguing for the war on terror? I mean, why would you tell the elites, hey, you're miffing up on the war on terror. Let me tell you how to fight it better. Why?
Well, I mean, his whole shtick has been a letter to the elite so far, saying, "Hey, here's let me tell you how to run your companies better. Let me tell you how to run the country better. Let me tell you to fight your war better." I mean, his whole shtick is like, "I'm the Dark Hobbit, and I'm going to help you elites do things better by giving you some coded Hobbit wisdom."
Oh, yeah, probably. Given that the elites flipped, granola eating hippies into warhawks starting World War III with Russia, I think they know a good deal more about how to run things than Moldbug does.
Yeah.
Not even Moldbug dreamed of a coup like that. Yeah. We'll ignore that, whatever that is. Okay, Logos, we've been
Oh boy.
Yeah.
Oh boy, Mister, I'm going to show for the corporations forever is explaining why he's not a libertarian. I can't wait.
Here we go. Why I'm not a libertarian. Mentions Moldbug, December 13th, 2007. This ought to be juicy. Fear not, gentle reader. Perhaps you have been linked to this essay quite casually, purely on the basis of its catchy title. And you're expecting one of these little chatty NPR-ish pieces that explain quite patiently to you, as to a retarded child, that libertarians are evil and the New Deal was the best thing since sliced bread. Hey, wait, Logos. I thought a couple of articles ago he said that the fascists of his own time could never get the elites to listen because they were wearing like the skins of like the worst enemies of the elites. Well, if anything outside the New Deal is evil, then by his own ipso facto statement, Moldbug is never going to succeed.
Well, you see, Todd, he's got a loophole because he's not actually wearing the skin of one of the elite's enemies. He's outside the Overton window on the New Deal, but there's no like anti-Overton window skin that he's wearing.
There we go. There we go. This is not one of these essays. UR is, in fact, an extremist bloc. Here at UR, we do our damnedest to have no concern whatever for the political fashions of 2007. I mean, except being a corporate simp that's, giving the giant green dildo fellatio, sure. You're not in all a slave to the political fashions of 2007, right, Logo?
You calm down.
One easy way to overcome this bias is to compare one's opinion not only to the fashions of 2007, but also of 1907 or even 1807, or even perhaps 1707, or what the heck, 7. The ancient algorithm, once known as by the cute Latin name of subspecie aeterantitatis, is guaranteed to produce extremist results. If our views conform perfectly to the fashions of 2007, they would strike the fashionable citizen of any of these other time points as crazed. Of course, the same is true for 1907 or 1707 or 7. If you are a libertarian, you are clearly resigned to the fact that the most fashionable people think of you as a nutcase. Today, we are going to ask you to crawl a little further out on that limbo and suggest that you replace your libertarian views with thoughts that are even more extreme. If you're not a libertarian, and if this, I'm not going to do the Latin, thing strikes you as somewhat dubious or shady, I feel no hesitation in informing you with absolute confidence that the common concept of progress, which perhaps you are operating under, is a lie, and a delusion and a snare, at least inasmuch as the term applies to the problem of human government, and not physics, oil painting, or backgammon. There is no reason to think the political designs of 2007 are any better than those of 1907, 1807, or 7. In fact, there's quite a bit of reason to think the truth is just the opposite. If you really do believe in progress, I'm sorry to have to inform you that your brain is full of little pockets of stringy black mycelium stuff, which will probably have to be cleaned out with the heavy brush. I do sympathize with your condition, and is one we have all suffered from. In fact, we probably still have it. However, you have a very serious case, and you will probably not be able to enjoy this here essay. Please feel free to browse elsewhere on the site. In other words, today's post is for people who either are or at least have been or have at least been tempted to become libertarians. To be a libertarian is to at least suspect that progress isn't all that it's cracked up to be, because it's obvious to any 12-year-old who can read Robert A. Heinlein that the world was much more libertarian than it is now, and that it easily could become so again. Both of these conditions demonstrate non-metonymic political change, invalidating the delusional concept of progress. Well, okay. Man, we can go to some deep lore about libertarianism, but this is here not at all clear. This is in part written before the thick versus thin libertarian debate. I think it was before. But the thick versus thin libertarian debate, of which you have like a progressive side represented by C4SS and a conservative side represented by HAPA, plus the plumb line, which is Block. Actually, he wrote an article called that. When was that published? Let's see. Plumb line libertarianism, Walter Block. Oh, 2002. Whoa. So, yeah, okay, 2002. So, yeah, okay, this is 5 years after the debate started. Moldbug, shame on you. Yeah, if you're like a left libertarian, then libertarianism implies progress. And if you're a right libertarian like HAPA, social progress, I mean, like, expanding more rights to minorities. And if you're on HAPA, it's opposite, but then Block is in the middle, so it's not at all clear that if you're a libertarian, you're opposed to progress. Logos?
Yeah, I don't got much more to add to that. That's true.
So this debate's already been going on, so Moldbug is just lazy for not appealing to it. Surely only one such disproof is required before we feel motivated to perform a thorough mental audit of all historical changes in social and political systems which come to us tagged with this fascinating if deadly label. One concept often associated with progress is revolution. Various fashionable opinions of 2007 assign various moral valences to various instances of revolution. The word is clearly extremely general. However, if we are to rid ourselves of these fashions, one simple way to start is with a simple default. All revolutions are bad. Your mileage may vary, but I found this default oddly compelling so far as I see the French Revolution as a criminal outrage of the mob led by leaders who were either unscrupulous, deluded, or both. I see the Russian Revolution as a criminal outrage of the mob led by leaders who were either unscrupulous, deluded, or both. Perhaps you agree with only one of these conclusions. Perhaps you agree with both. But if you add a third revolution to this set, which one would it be? And this is the first reason I'm not a libertarian. Libertarianism is more or less basically the ideology of the American Revolution. And the American Revolution was my own personal opinion, more or less basically a criminal outrage of the mob led by leaders who were either unscrupulous, deluded, or both. I will grant that if I had to pick any mob leaders in history, I would probably pick Washington, Jefferson, and Hamilton, although Caesar, Cicero, and either Cato would have certainly earned a draft choice somewhere. However, a politician is a politician. The profession is a fundamentally criminal one. I'm sure James Gandolfini would do a pretty good job at it. Gio, I wonder why CEO isn't also considered a fundamentally criminal profession, Logos.
Well, you see, because they have obligations to the shareholders, and they have market value they have to give to consumers, and it's their responsibility, Todd.
Fiduciary responsibility.
That's right.
Don't you forget it.
But politicians, they don't have any responsibility. They can just do whatever they want once they're in power. So
isn't that funny? If you have trouble swallowing this uber cynical picture of the American Revolution, let me recommend two books. The first is Murray Rothbard's great 4-volume Conceived in Liberty, now available online. It's a real tragedy that the 5th volume, which would have taken us to the Constitution, was never finished. The second is Bernard Bailyn's Ideological Origins of the American Revolution, which is sadly only sold in stores. Well, there you go. I mean, I guess we just BTFO the American Revolution, Logos. Case closed. Done.
Yep.
We're done. I mean, it's just ridiculous that Murray Rothbard and like credible historian are sort of like in the same context here. It's so bad. I mean, wow. Rothbard is surely one of the top 10 philosophers of the 20th century. Whoa, there you go, Logos.
There you go. Well, I mean, 20th century. I mean, how many good philosophers do you know of in the 20th century?
Not many. Not many.
So I'll allow it. Not that I like Rothbard, but I mean, who's his competition?
Well, I will have to give credit to some of okay, Baudrillard, he's a good philosopher. I'd also give it to Jacques Ellul, he's a good philosopher. I'm starting to warm up to some of the French critics of capitalism because you get acceleration from them. So that's like the 60s and 70s. And then Heidegger. So we have some.
He's still a top 10. You got a ways to go to kick him out.
Okay, yeah. Let's see. Besides more or less the founder of modern American political libertarianism, and besides being the acknowledged dean of the Austrian School of Economics, he was also a world-class historian trained under Joseph Dorfman at Columbia. You know, this is the thing, okay? This is the thing, Logos. For all these allegedly great libertarian historians, why have all of them uniformly not engaged with the Sutton thesis?
You'd know more about that than me. I don't even know why I'm being asked. It's probably rhetorical.
No. I mean, the historical evidence is clear that Wall Street backed communists. The question I'm asking you is an ideological question. If these are such great world-class historians, why don't they write about it?
Well, because why would they engage their enemy's narrative? I mean, that's just silly. They're great because they know how to play tactically, Todd.
But wait, Sutton's not really their enemy, though. He's coming from the same class interest.
It doesn't matter. He's a traitor.
He's a class traitor.
He's a class traitor. So we're going to ignore him. Ignore and shun.
I find it really interesting. Do you know what Moldbug said? Remember way back when Moldbug said if Ron Paul and the CFR are in agreement, we need to listen?
Yes.
Why is it that, like, Rothbard and libertarians take the CFR line on the Bolshevik Revolution?
Good question.
It is a good question. To paraphrase the working class song, which side are you on? I'm beginning to wonder, Logos.
I never wondered the opposite.
Conceived in Liberty is a full of primary research and original interpretations. It is a portrait of George Washington as a bumbling buffoon, for example, may be challenged, but it is neither unsupportive or unmemorable. And one thing you will see in Rothbard, though Rothbard tends to paint incidents such as the Loyalists rebellion in suspiciously golden light, is the importance of mob violence and paramilitary armed gangs in American political history. Not just in the Revolution, but throughout the colonial period. My general view of CIL achievement, though it is that it works a little too hard to emphasize the prevalence of colonial ideas which approximate modern libertarianism, understanding strands that are more clearly ancestral to socialism and other statisms. But when you combine Rothbard with Balin, a mainstream historian of considerable renown, the result is damning. Ideological Origins, which appeared in 1967, won both the Pulitzer and Bancroft prizes. It is absolutely impossible to infer any opinions that Balin may hold from this carefully crafted book, a feat I consider perverse but still must admire. His history, however, is beyond reproach and is generally considered seminal. What Balin shows us is the rebels of the American Revolution were motivated by an ideology that was utterly deluded, that amounted to no more than a wacky conspiracy theory. The point is not even slightly arguable. Their interpretation of British politics simply had no basis in reality. Since this delusional interpretation was the linchpin of their argument for rebellion, and since their reliance on street violence and paramilitary formations is indisputable, they can fairly be classed as unscrupulous or deluded mob leaders, regardless of any classification in the scruples department, a historical task which often verges on the impossible. Especially diligent readers may enjoy Frederick Scott Oliver's Alexander Hamilton, an essay on American Union, with this wonderful portrayal of Thomas Jefferson as a scoundrel. I'll let Balin tell the story from his own foreword. This book has developed from a study that was first undertaken a number of years ago when Howard Mumford Jones, the editor-in-chief of the John Harvard Library, invited me to prepare a collection of pamphlets of the American Revolution for publication in that series. Like all students of American history, I knew well perhaps a half dozen of the most famous pamphlets of the Revolution, obviously worth republication. And I knew also of others, another half dozen or so, that would probably be worth considering. The project was attractive to me. It did not appear to be practically burdensome, and since in addition it was related to a book I was then preparing on the 18th century politics, I agreed to undertake it. The starting point of the work was the compilation of a complete bibliography of the pamphlets. This alone proved to be a considerable task, and it was in assembling this list that I discovered the magnitude of the project I had embarked on. The full bibliography of pamphlets related to the Anglo-American struggle, published in the colonies to the year 1776, contains not a dozen or so items, but over 400. In the end, I concluded that no fewer than 72 of them ought to be republished. But sheer numbers were not the most important measure of the magnitude of the project. Pamphlets included all sorts of writings, treatises on political theory, essays on history, political arguments, sermons, correspondence, poems, and they display all sorts of literary devices. But for all their variety, they have in common one distinctive characteristic. They are, to an unusual degree, explanatory. They reveal not merely positions, but the reasons why positions were taken. They reveal motive and understanding, the assumptions, beliefs, and ideas, the articulated worldview that lay behind the manifest events of the time. As a result, I found myself, as I read through these many documents, studying not simply a particular medium of publication, but through these documents, nothing less than the ideological origins of the American Revolution. And I found myself viewing these origins with surprise, for the interior view from the vantage point of the pamphlets was different from what I had expected. The task consequently took an increasing in excitement for much of the history of the American Revolution has fallen into the condition that overtakes so many of the great events of the past. It is, as Professor Trevor Roper has written in another connection, taken for granted. But our explanations, interpretations, assumptions, we gradually make it seem automatic, natural, inevitable. We remove from it the sense of wonder, the unpredictability, and therefore the freshness it ought to have. The pamphlets do reveal the influence of Enlightenment thought, and they do show the effective force of certain religious ideas, of the common law, and also of classical literature, but they reveal most significantly the close integration of these elements in a pattern of, to me at least, surprising design. Surprising because of the prominence in it of still another tradition. Interwoven with yet still distinct form these more familiar strands of thought. The distinctive influence had been transmitted more directly to the colonialists by a group of early 18th century radical publicists and opposition politicians in England who carried forth into the 18th century and applied to the political age of Walpole the particular strain of anti-authoritarianism bred in the upheaval of the English Civil War. I had began to see a new meaning in the phrases that I, like most historians, had read dismissively as mere rhetoric and propaganda, slavery, corruption, conspiracy. These inflammatory words were used so forcefully by writers of so great a variety of social statuses, political positions, and religious persuasions that they fitted so logically into the pattern of radical and opposition thought, and they reflected so clearly the realities of an age in which monarchical autocracy flourished, in which the stability and freedom of England's mixed constitution was recent and remarkable achievement, and in which the fear of conspiracy against constituted authority was built into the very structure of politics, that I began to suspect they meant something very real to both their writers and their readers, that there were real fears, real anxieties, a sense of real danger behind these paraphrases, and not merely the desire to influence by rhetoric and propaganda the inert minds of an otherwise passive populace. The more I read, the less useful it seemed to me was the whole idea of propaganda in its modern meaning when applied to the writings of the American Revolution, a view that I hope to develop at length on another occasion. In the end, I was convinced that the fear of comprehensive conspiracy against liberty throughout the English-speaking world, a conspiracy believed to have been nourished in corruption, and of which it was felt oppression in America, was only the most imminently visible part, lay at the heart of the American Revolutionary movement. Now, note how gracefully Balin stakes out the facts that indisputably no such conspiracy existed. In other words, our founding fathers were more or less the truthers of their day. Wait, he didn't say that no conspiracy. Balin didn't say no conspiracy existed if we just go by what we read. That's not what he said.
Mm-hmm.
He said the founding fathers believed that there was a conspiracy, and he made no comment on that belief, one way or the other.
Right.
So if Moldbug is intending to convince us just from the paragraphs we've read, it doesn't do anything. It's just a account of, noticing a pattern of belief that had otherwise been overlooked by previous historians.
Mm-hmm.
Or to put it differently, America obtained its independence because of a war that was started by people who were generally terrified of the 18th century equivalent of black helicopters. From a later chapter, page 94, it is the meaning imparted to the events after 1763 by this integrated group of attitudes and ideas that lies behind the colonist rebellion. In the context of these ideas, the controversial issues centering on the question of Parliament's jurisdiction in America require, as a group, new and overwhelming significance. The colonists believed they saw emerging from the welter of events during the decade of the Stamp Act a pattern whose meaning was unmistakable. They saw in the measures taken by the British government and in the actions of their officials in the colonies, something which their peculiar inheritance of thought had prepared them for only too well, something they had long conceived to be a possibility in view of the known tendencies of history and of the present state of affairs in England. They saw about them with increasing clarity not merely mistaken or even evil policies violating the principles on which freedom rested, but what appeared to be evidence of nothing less than a deliberate assault launched surreptitiously by plotters against liberty both in England and in America. The danger to America, it was believed, was in fact only the small, immediately visible part of the greater whole whose ultimate manifestation would be the destruction of the English Constitution with all rights and privileges embedded in it. This belief transformed the meaning of the colonist struggle, and it added an inner accelerator to the movement of opposition. For, once assumed, it could not be easily dispelled. Denial only confirmed it, since what conspirators profess is not what they believe, the ostensible is not the real, and the real is deliberately maligned. It was this, the overwhelming evidence as they saw it, that they were faced with a conspiracy against liberty, determined at all costs to gain ends which their words dissembled, that was signaled to the colonists after 1763, and it was this above all else that ended and propelled them to revolution. Suspicion of the ever-present latent danger of an active conspiracy of power against liberty was becoming manifest within the British Empire of same specific form, and developing in coordinated phases rose in the consciousness of a large segment of the American people, before many of the famous political events of the struggle with England took place. No adherent of a nonconformist church or a sect in the 18th century was free from suspicion that the Church of England, an arm of the English state, was working to bring all subjects of the crown into the community of the church. And since toleration was official and nonconformist influence in English politics formidable, it was doing so by stealth, disguising its efforts, turning to improper devices that had been created for benign purposes. In particular, the Society for the Propaganda of the Gospel in English parts, an arm of the church created in 1701 to aid in the bringing of the gospel to the pagan Indians, was said by 1763 to have a long had formal design to root out Presbyterianism and to establish both episcopacy and bishops. This suspicion, which had smoldered in the breasts of New Englanders in nonconformists throughout the colonies, half a century or more, had burst into flame repeatedly, but never so violently as in 1763. In the Mayhew-Apthorpe controversy, which climaxed years of growing anxiety that plans were being made secretly to establish an American episcopate. To Mayhew, as to Presbyterian and congregational leaders throughout the colonies, there could be little doubt that the threat was real. Many of the facts were known, facts concerning maneuvers in London and in America. Anglican leaders in New York and New Jersey had met almost publicly to petition England for an American episcopate. And there could be little doubt also of the role of the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in this undercover operation. For if the ostensible goal of the society was gospelizing of the pagans, Indians, and Negroes, its true goal was manifestly revealed when it established missions in places like Cambridge, Massachusetts, which had not had a resident Indian since the 17th century and was well equipped with Orthodox preachers. Such missions, Mayhew wrote, have all the appearance of entering wedges, carrying on the crusade or spiritual siege of our churches with the hope that they will one day submit to an episcopal sovereign. Bishops, he wrote unblinkingly, in reply to the Archbishop of Canterbury, have commonly been instruments in arbitrary reigns of establishing a tyranny over the bodies and souls of men, and their establishment in America would mark the end of liberty in Massachusetts and elsewhere. By 1765, when the final exchanges in this pamphlet war were published, it was commonly understood in New England and elsewhere that the stamping and episcopizing of our colonies were only different branches of the same plan of power, etc., etc., etc. And this is only the beginning. The plot goes far beyond episcopizing. If you enjoy this sort of badinage, the book is available cheaply. It requires a study in abnormal political psychology. Again, nothing the author says argues that the conspiracy is false. I'm still waiting for the big reveal where he says, oh, and by the way, the founding fathers were under this delusion. I didn't get that yet. Did you?
Mm-mm.
This is literally just Moldbug making it up. Like, I mean, unless it's a big book, he says. So I guess unless we have to read the whole book, he hasn't given us anything from the book that would indicate that anything he said is correct. And
I still don't know what this has to do with libertarianism.
Yeah, good point. Oh, well, I guess the TLDR is logos. the founding fathers are crackpot truthers. So libertarians are bad because I guess they're just like the same crackpot truthers.
That makes my head hurt, but go on.
That's all I got right now. Here's a diary entry from someone who didn't buy it. That this was the issue for thoughtful and informed people on which decisions of loyalty to the government turned. It is nowhere so clearly and sensitively revealed as in the record of Peter Van Schacht, left of his tormented meditations of January 1776. A well-born, scholarly, and articulate New Yorker of 29 who prepared himself for deciding the question of his personal loyalty by undertaking in seclusion a critical examination of the works of Locke, Vattel, Montesquieu, Grotius, Beccaria, and Pufendorf. He noted first his fear of the destructive consequences of conceding Parliament's right to bind the colonies in all cases whatsoever. That danger, he wrote, was perfectly clear. But my difficulty arises from this, he said, that taking the whole of the acts complained of together, they do not, I think, manifest a system of slavery, but may fairly be imputed to human frailty and difficulty of the subject. Most of them seem to have sprung out of particular occasions and are unconnected with each other. In short, I think these acts may have been passed without a preconceived plan of enslaving us, and it appears to me that the more favorable construction ought to ever be put in the conduct of our rulers. I feel the same way about the Jews myself. Wow. He said it, not me, Logos.
Yeah.
He said it, not me. But here's the thing, right? Okay, so I know, far be it for me to steel man the libertarians, but here I'm going to do it, Logos. So let's look at all these abuses that this particular letter, the author of this particular letter thinks was merely the result of human frailty and poor judgment. Now, if you look at all of these coming together, and it looks for all the world like a wedge and a boot to crush your neck, are you going to really just wait, Logos, and be like, well, we'll just charitably interpret the king and the parliament as always being incompetent?
Yeah, no.
No, and let's be honest about this, right? Let's play. I can't think of his name. Who's that French Christian who says, take the wager about God?
Pascal.
Pascal's wager. Let's do Pascal's wager. Let's say it is only nothing but weak-minded people that are frail. You act. Oh, well, I guess you die if the revolution fails. But let's say that they are what you think it is, and you're enslaved forever. Well, how would you do that, Logos? How would you do that wager?
Yeah, the wager is what? That they're incompetent, and they might be incompetent forever, or competent, they want to enslave you forever. I mean, that it doesn't even sound like a wager. That just sounds like either option's bad when you need new management.
Well, no, I mean is if you launch a revolution and you do it under mistaken pretenses.
Oh, got it. Yeah. So if you don't launch it, you could be enslaved forever. And if you do launch it, you might have oopsied, but you're guaranteed to be free. And given the incompetence of these idiots, that might be a good thing anyway. You might also be dead, but you can only die once, so screw it.
But again, right? But this is the point, right? It's if we're going to do a Pascal's wager scenario, it's not entirely clear from the evidence available that we've been told from what Moldbug has shown us that this was an entirely unrealistic assumption.
Right.
Now, Von Schacht was, of course, a Tory, or he has no doubt would have preferred Loyalist. Now, if we update the conflict between patriots and Loyalists and look at our presently bilaterally symmetrical political system, which side is the descendants of the patriots and which is the descendant of the Loyalists? Well, this ought to be good, Logos. It's a trick question, of course. The Loyalists have no political descendant. There is no American alive today whose loyalty to the British crown was passed down to him in an unbroken chain from 18th century Loyalists. You would be about as likely to find a native speaker of Etruscan. Both Democrats and Republicans are factions of patriot. Well, Logos, hold on. Now, we know that Moldbug doesn't like the Democratic Party, at least so he says. But we do have North American descendants of Loyalists. You know where they live? Canada. Now, what's Canada's political thought, Logos?
Oh, boy.
Yeah. How do you like them apples, Moldbug? How do those Tories turn out, huh?
Mm-hmm.
Those Tory Loyalists. Oh, wait, it's Trudeau's Canada. Oops. And yet the Loyalists were right, at least on this one rather important question. Britain was not on a path to a weird 1984-like future with gold parades and epaulets crushing under the iron heel of the king, the Church of England, and the Lords. Rather, the power of throne and altar and a fief in Britain had been dwindling almost monotonically since Mary Tudor, a process which, of course, has continued to this day. With a ridiculous figurehead queen, an utterly gormless Prince of Wales, a true leveler, and a soy dissident druid as Archbishop of Canterbury, and PM, who apparently I still have a hard time believing this one, has the power to arbitrarily hire and fire peers of the realm. What could be more humiliating for the lion and the unicorn? I'm afraid they have both been getting it in the butt from Uncle Sam, and not since September 11th either. The Loyalists were right, and yet they have no intellectual descendants at all. Not in the United States, not anywhere else. Logos, that's Canada. That's Britain itself. These people were butthurt for the longest time about the American Revolution.
Yep.
And like we still have, king and country types in Britain and in Canada. And they're more far left, more degenerate than in America. And it's like, what gives, Moldbug? Like, this is ridiculous. At least from the point of view of their political DNA, they were simply obliterated, not unlike the Cavaliers, to whom their resemblance is more than a passing. And in what folder does almost everyone alive file this event? I'm afraid that folder is progress. Well, hold up. Back up, Logos. Back up. Look. So Moldbug says the Cavaliers have no descendants. But Moldbug has also said earlier, when he was imposing his ridiculous Puritan thesis, that the Cavaliers settled in the American South and became the gentry that fought the Civil War.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Huh. And we still have some of those families around even to this day.
Mm-hmm.
Huh. Wait, so almost like there are still descendants of the Cavaliers and the Tories.
Yep.
But they're just far left progressives. That's the problem, Logos. That's the problem. I mean, let's look at Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. I mean, there's the blue bloods for you. There you go. What do you know, right, Logos? What do you know?
Mm-hmm.
For a libertarian, especially a paleo-libertarian, corrupting this historically received fallacy of moral valence should be an obviously attractive option, because it allows us to assign all three of the great revolutions of the last 250 years to the same category that of crazed, lawless violence. Okay, so notice here, this is the operative word here, paleo-libertarian. It was kind of clear he was talking to them already, because clearly this wouldn't compel a left libertarian. And at the time, paleo-libertarianism was still kind of a thing. So I guess, and that was what the Mises Institute represented at the time as well. So you could be forgiven for believing this was mainstream libertarianism, because I kind of thought that was mainstream libertarianism in 2007. So at least the audience, even if that wasn't actually the case in hindsight, one could be forgiven for thinking otherwise. But unfortunately, once we reject the American Revolution, we must also disown the label of libertarian as simply confusing. I will suggest a couple of replacement labels in a moment. In the meantime, please feel free to just wander around with nothing on your shirt. Rejecting the American Revolution is essentially problematic for a libertarian because the great libertarian writers of the 20th century, Rothbard, Rand, and Nozick, all define libertarianism as an ethical ideal. Probably the best rigorous one-book definition of the mainstream libertarian or anarcho-capitalist term, which has always struck me as utterly dorky, perspective is Rothbard's The Ethics of the New Liberty. Yeah, remember, Logos, we debunked his argument for self-ownership in that book.
Was he the one that got negation wrong?
No, that was Hoppe.
That was Hoppe. I always get them confused.
Yeah. EOL works very hard to define moral principles that make libertarianism philosophically inelucidable. Needless to say, these principles are none other than the Lockean natural rights of the American Revolution. The theological roots of these rights are obvious. Rothbard may not have been a Christian, but Locke certainly was. And suggestion that they are in some sense philosophically universal violates Hume's Aesop principle. Logos, I want to know how Humean got so many Thomist followers.
Mm-hmm.
Can we get an answer on that? I mean, this guy is just flexing Hume all the time.
Yep.
Most libertarian principles cannot be logically justified, except an appeal to the historical traditions that have descended to all Americans as received wisdom via the patriot branch of the evolutionary tree. A libertarian, therefore, is fundamentally a conservative. Well, there you go, Logos. Anything to say?
No.
Yeah, I mean, letting private forces rule the world is a completely conservative position, Logos.
Oh, absolutely. What could go wrong?
I mean, isn't that basically what Aristotle said, like corporations run the world?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, it was his favorite position in the Nicomachean Ethics. The only ethical force that's allowed to rule are private mercenaries.
And if you admit that the Loyalists may have been right and the Patriots may have been a bunch of crap hats, conservatism takes a heavy slash to the neck from Occam's razor, because a so-called conservative who is a patriot or even a supporter of the Glorious Revolution is someone who believes in progress up to a certain point, but no further. Well, you know who else believes in a point of progress, Logos, but to no further? Somebody who believes in the infallible right to rule of a corporation, because last I remember, in the Middle Ages, such a thing as a modern corporation didn't exist.
True.
So were the Dutch progress with the first, joint stock companies?
Yeah, I guess they were.
While such a position may indeed prove correct, there is certainly no reason to give it the benefit of the doubt. In fact, considering the length of time for which it has held that benefit, it probably should be treated as if it were a boiling radioactive vial of Ebola. And this is the second reason I'm a libertarian, because by defining libertarianism as an ethical imperative, libertarians assign themselves an unsolvable problem and proceed not to solve it. As the miracle of 1787 spirals into the abyss, as the need for some sane alternative grows even more obvious, libertarianism as a political force has proven itself only slightly more effective than the Maharishi, and that's in the US. In Europe, the situation is even worse. Perhaps there is a reason for this. Wait, Logos, though, what is the question that they don't solve? He didn't tell us what it was.
I'm still confused about a lot of things.
Yeah, okay. In my opinion, the practical problem with grounding libertarianism in the ideas of the American Revolution is that Americans no longer hold these ideals. Europeans never did. Both today follow a moral code which is essentially socialist. It is true that this is the natural consequence of education at the hands of a government which is essentially socialist. Well, there you go, Logos. Socialism is just government doing government stuff. And here, I thought socialism was the abolition of private property and the government controlling the means of production, but what do I know?
Yeah, I know, right? You listen to Based Moldbug, he'll tell you what socialism is.
It is also irrelevant. The consequence is the reality. You cannot explain to people that they ought to believe in, say, freedom of contract as a fundamental human right when in fact they don't. As Hume, man, I tell you what, these Thomists need to be told how much Moldbug is in love with Hume. Pointed out, ethical axioms are not debatable. The response of many libertarians, especially those who, for some awful, unimaginable reason, seem to have congregated in the watershed of the Potomac, is often to borrow a trick from the Fabian Society and to try to steer Washington gradually and moderately in the direction of smaller, freer government. They should know better, and we'll see shortly the monotonic growth pattern of the state is not a coincidence. It is one thing to surf that wave, it is another to paddle out through the breaker. When we look at the result of 25 years of Beltway libertarianism, we see hardly any substantial policy achievements. I'm sure there are some, but I can't think of any. Well, hold on, Logos. Unless the actual policy achievements were deprivatization and mergers.
Also, if they're trying to make government smaller, why would they want policy achievements? Their achievement would be the absence of policy.
Yeah. And when we compare even the most aggressive visions to the set of changes that are returned to the liberal text of the Constitution, let alone a Rothbardian anarchy would involve, we see the essentially decorative nature of the Beltway libertarians. I'm sure they have a lot of fun trying, but inevitable failure is no service to any cause. I mean, why would anyone come to the conclusion that the U.S. political system is in some sense reformable? Logos! That's what Moldbug has been saying for the last month we've been reading him.
Yeah.
What?
Yep.
What? The whole point was to reform it from the inside by seducing them. What is this?
Well, no. He wants to seduce the cultural elites and reform cultural elites from within culture. to stage a revolution against the government, but not like an open air, like torches and pitchforks revolution, kind of like Moldbug has this really weird view that the 60s and 70s came about and this whole turn happened because a bunch of hipster elites basically had like a soft coup in the arts to strong arm the politicians and the wealthy who wanted to be liked by the artsy circles into thinking what they wanted to think. So that's Moldbug's idea of like an elitist cultural revolution.
That's like delusional fantasy. All these people had like either corporate or deep state backing.
Yeah, that's what we've been saying, obviously. Yeah. So yeah, he doesn't think the government's reformable from inside. He thinks that you have to have an outside force of people do a soft revolution, or the system's going to break, and then when it breaks, you have to fix the right way.
All right. And all the energy and money and time the Beltway libertarians put in trying to apply a single smudge of lipstick to some flap of flesh in the remote vicinity of the hog's maw is energy and money and time uninvested in putting the beast to sleep. Wait, are we supposed to kill the beast or seduce it? I'm not sure anymore.
Well, I think basically his criticism is they're wasting a lot of time and money on lobbying organizations, like the Cato Institute and things like that, to try to like wrench government and get it in line with policy.
Oh, there you go, Cato Institute, right there.
Oh, I didn't even see that.
Right there.
Yeah, that'd be an example. And they're spending so long trying to, and so much time and money trying to like get politicians to do what they want through lobbying and stuff like that, that I think what Moldbug is saying is to just be more efficient to just completely forget it and woo the elite is basically the case he's going to make for him.
Wow, that's so much more successful. I'm sold already, Logos.
I know, right? I mean, it's clearly never failed.
Never failed. Moreover, since the official story of Washington is that it represents everyone, it fits all sizes. It contains multitudes. A few decorative pseudo-libertarians may be just the right camouflage for it to weather another century's storms. A quick question for the fans of the Cato Institute, the George Mason economist, Reason, and the like. If you could vote on our proposition to abolish the U.S. federal government, would you vote yes or no? If the latter, which side are you on? If the former, have you ever thought of mentioning this option? So we arrive at an impasse. We find libertarianism attractive in a general sort of way. We feel vaguely that there is something fishy and awful about government, at least government as it is today. However, real libertarianism has no prospect of gaining a political foothold, and watered-down pseudo-libertarianism defeats the purpose. Okay, this right here is true. Real libertarianism has no prospect of getting a political foothold, and watered-down defeats the purpose. From the point of view of those who believe in the cause, is the way I'm reading that.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps I've dug deep enough, in some rich seam of defeat and despair, but in case I haven't, let's observe that the United States wants a healthy and functioning libertarian constitution with the 9th and 10th Amendments that were anything but ink blots. 220 years later, we have what we have now. Well, that's a stupid argument, Logos. Let's look at like Russia in 1812 and it beats Napoleon. What do we have 105 years later, Logos?
Wait, say that again?
So he's saying that we should ditch the Constitution because 220 years later it failed. So, okay, after Russia beats Napoleon in 1812, what happens 105 years later?
Well, the revolution.
Yeah, so it already failed. So WTF? What gives? What makes one failure better than another failure?
Mm-hmm.
This is what I've never got about the right. They have this like fetish for digging up old failed experiments and then pointing the finger and say, well, your experiment failed. And then you point the finger right back around and tell them that their experiment failed. And they're just like, monkey see no evil, hear no evil, do no evil.
Uh-huh.
Like, what explains this, Logos?
Well, Todd, theirs lasted for thousands of years. Therefore.
Well, then just all be Hindus then. Done.
That's actually a pretty good response.
Does this inspire you with great confidence in limited government as a durable and effective engineering principle? Suppose by some miracle libertarians elect Ron Paul and he actually succeeds in reforming Washington and restoring the 1787 interpretation of the Constitution. And how many years would this last? Why would we expect different results in the second go? Bingo! Logos! Let's say you go back to Tsarist Russia, 1916, when everything is all peachy keen. What makes you think it wouldn't go back to the Lenin in a year or two?
Exactly. Yeah.
Like, this is insane.
Yep.
Unlike so many of their political heirs, the American founders were, I believe, extremely thoughtful, discerning, and scrupulous men. Okay. I thought he just said they're unscrupulous, rumor mongers and mob leaders.
What about mob leaders? What?
No, he just said that the American revolutionary leaders were all, a bunch of ruffians and outlaws and mob leaders and delusional. Now he's like, they're thoughtful, discerning, and scrupulous.
Yeah.
What the heck is that?
I have no idea.
Their paranoid misunderstandings of British politics are best described as cultural rather than personal factors. The engine they designed was a good effort and it deserves at least some respect. But it was operating wildly outside the design envelope. Consider the fate of the Electoral College by at least 1800. The situation has hardly improved since then, and we want to go back to this? Well, I don't know. I mean, there's a certain lunatic I'm reading right now who wants to go back to Tsarist Russia. How did that turn out?
Wait, does he want to go back to Tsarist Russia?
Well, he talks about Tsarist Russia, Bourbon France, all of these complete failures.
Well, he doesn't want to go back to him. I mean, what he said he wants to do is he wants the royalty to basically change. His analogy is he wants them to change from being a family business to a publicly owned business of shareholders that may or may not still be ran in the family by the short term. So he doesn't want to go back to the way exactly it was. He just wants, okay. They're not corporate enough. He wants Tsarist Russia with more corporate influence is what he wants. That's what he wants.
All right. Well, the U.S., like Britain, has an unwritten constitution enforced by precedent and custom. The difference is the U.S. also has a written constitution, which we pretend is identical to the actual thing. But to call the historically accreted transformation from 1787 Constitution to the 2007 Constitution law non-trivial is like saying it hurts when an elephant. Yeah, okay. It would be a fascinating exercise to actually write down what the Constitution would say if it actually described the structure of the U.S. government today. Perhaps some law student should try it. Because this disparity between the written law and the judicially constructed reality certainly does no service to anyone. And it strikes me as much more straightforward to recognize the latter than to return to the former. If nothing else, formalization of the present reality is an excellent starting point for any kind of reform. So I hope I have presented a reasonable case that while history is never to be disregarded, the dream of a return to the ideals or laws or values of the 18th century post-colonial America is neither logically sound, historically justified, politically achievable, nor socially efficacious. I mean, Logos, he's done no such thing. He's done actually nothing.
Yeah.
Libertarianism, at least libertarianism as we know it, does not solve the problem it purports to address. Logos, what is the problem that it purports to address? I still don't know what it is.
I don't know either.
Ergo, it is a political latrille, different from all the other quack political remedies of the 20th century, only in the sophistication of its appeal and the harmlessness of its effects. And this is the third reason I'm not a libertarian, because I'm an engineer. Okay, well, that sums up the problem in a nutshell. Thank you, Moldbug. I find libertarian government an extremely desirable outcome. In just a second, we will look at other ways to achieve this outcome. However, as a moral imperative or a political design or historical tradition, libertarianism does not strike me as an effective means to this end. In this, we will compare libertarianism to the peace movement. Both have buzzwords, liberty, peace, with incontestable positive valence. No one can be against liberty or against peace. However, what the actual peace movement has done is to associate this movement with a certain set of policies, which in practice translate, e.g. in the Middle East, to a fairly aggressive brand of irredentism. They claim that if this irredentist program is fully and properly applied, the result will be peace. Obviously, it has not been so applied, and no peace has resulted. And I don't believe that. After 60 years of this, my belief that the peace process is in fact the cause of the Arab-Israeli conflict can be considered prima facie absurd. Similarly, libertarians want liberty, and do we all, I hope. But does the actual political program of libertarianism advance the prospect of liberty? All schools of libertarianism, whether Rothbardian or Randian, or newly stillborn Nozikian, rest on the idea of limited government. Well, no, Rothbard is an anarchist. So at least he would call himself one. So of course it doesn't rest on limited government. And frankly, this is a strange thing to say because 2007 to like 2016 was the heyday of online libertarians, which was primarily run by ANCAPs, which was primarily saying the idea of limited government is absurd, so we should get rid of the government. I'm not sure who he's responding to here.
Again, paleo libertarians, Cato Institute, those types of people, Beltway libertarians.
Okay. Randians, maybe, right? They do believe in the state.
Probably.
If some government is limited by its own volition, it can abandon these limits at any time. Historical experience suggests that the sacred document trick is often extremely limited utility in preventing it from doing so. If the government is limited by some external power, it is not a government in the usual sense of the word, and we should direct our attention to the limiting power. It is at this point that the libertarian typically reveals his inner Democrat and suggests that the sovereign power of the people will preserve liberty. First, this hasn't exactly worked in practice. Second, true sovereignty demands actual military superiority, which may have existed in the people of 1787, but has certainly gone missing since then. If the people of any modern country faced off against the rest of the population, each side being united, the former would win every time. That's not true, Logos. Look at all the revolutions that overthrew existing governments, including Vietnam.
Right.
That's just not...
And why would the military be united?
Good question. I don't know. Well, no, actually, no, the military is acting alone. It doesn't seem to have any support. It's the military versus the people.
Well, it says each side being united.
Right.
So the military side's united, the people side's united. Why would the military side being united?
Good question. The former would win every... Again, that's just not true. Historical realities are there. And third, the state can escape this trick quite easily because it can indoctrinate its subjects to despise rebellion and love its motherly care. Well, if that worked, then why did the Soviet Union fall, Logos?
Exactly. Yep.
This is just... Where do you come up with these? Okay, as an engineer, shouldn't Moldbug be even passingly aware of the concept of diminishing returns?
Yeah.
Why does Moldbug have no understanding of the idea of diminishing returns?
I don't know. What's the diminishing returns he's missing, though?
Well, the state can't keep doing the same thing indefinitely and getting the same positive result. Eventually, propaganda will fail, and when the propaganda fails, and that's the only trick they have, the state falls. As we saw in Soviet Russia.
Got it, yeah.
I think the reason why Moldbug doesn't see the world in terms of diminishing returns is because, as he said, he's a computer programmer. If you live in cyberspace, you can create the illusion of infinite growth. You can create the illusion that the more you do X. So think of any strategy video game, Logos. I mean, I guess at some point there are still diminishing returns, but it's not as readily apparent.
Right.
You can think that, hey, if I have this character and I keep on adding more points to his like strength stat, he's just going to be able to clobber anybody in a melee. And it's not as readily apparent in that world, the law of diminishing return, as it is in our world.
Generally, how they do it in those type of video games is they just make the resources you have to spend to get them each point more than the last. And so it's like, yes, you can dump all your resources into a character to make them really strong, but using the same time and other resources, what other characters could you have strengthened instead?
Sure.
Yeah.
So I see really no value at all in libertarianism as we know it. Therefore, please allow me to suggest an alternative. This should not be news to you, our readers, but let's see if I can summarize it in a few paragraphs without cheating by linking to old posts. Okay, you know what? Let's back this up first. How did this guy that threw shade on literally the entire spectrum of the right at the time, from ethno-nationalists to libertarians, get to be so influential? Like, normally you don't attack people to their face and then get promoted to, like, top billing.
Again, the one thing that we just keep coming back to when we have this conversation is he was able to give a really good explanation for why they were failing. Why is the Cato Instituting failing despite all the donor money it gets, all the lobbying it does? Why are all the other libertarian think tanks failing given this? So the libertarians might disagree with Moldbug and still be libertarians, but I don't think they can deny his analysis of why their think tanks just aren't going to do what they think they're going to do.
Well, okay, but then this begs the question. I've been telling people what they're doing isn't going to work and why, and it continually happens. So why did Moldbug get successful and not me?
Time, basically. The only privilege I believe in is temporal privilege. The person who's born first and can say the profound thing first gets more acclaim than anybody who would equally be smart but says it second.
Yeah, the problem was I didn't know how to use the internet that well in 2007.
Well, yeah, I mean, who did? I mean, older people that were in tech, basically.
Yes. No, temporal privilege is real. The essential characteristic of libertarianism is its respect for property. To a libertarian, property is an inalienable human right and an ethical absolute. Rothbard invests many chapters, such as this one and this one, on the question of whether property titles or transfers are morally legitimate and binding. As Nozick points out, the standard libertarian logic on these points is frequent, blurry, and often completely circular. For example, here is Rothbard on why you can't sell yourself into slavery. Hence, the enforceability in libertarian theory of voluntary slave contracts. Suppose that Smith makes the following agreement with Jones Corporation. Smith, for the rest of his life, will obey all orders under whatever conditions that the Jones Corporation wishes to lay down. Well, the first thing, Logos, how isn't that just being a wage slave already?
Yeah.
Like, what's the difference here? Now, in libertarian theory, there is nothing to prevent Smith from making this agreement and from serving the Jones Corporation and from obeying the latter's orders indefinitely. The problem comes when at some later date Smith changes his mind and decides to leave. Shall he be held to his former voluntary promise? Our contention, and one that is fortunately upheld under present law, is that Smith's promise was not a valid, i.e. not enforceable contract. There is no transfer of title in Smith's agreement because Smith's control over his own body and will are inalienable. Since that control cannot be alienated, the agreement was not a valid contract and therefore should not be enforceable. Smith's agreement was a mere promise, which it might be held is morally obligated to keep, but which should not be legally obligatory. Well, see, this is strange, Logo. So now you have two kinds of property. Property that is alienable, property that is inalienable, and they're so fundamentally different. In what sense are they both property?
Yep.
I mean, what? I mean, you have to have all these fuzzy buzzwords that just fall apart. I.e., you can't sell yourself into slavery because you control your own body and your will are inalienable. I.e., you can't alienate them. But if you could sell yourself into slavery. A masterpiece of circular reasoning orbiting around a human ought. I mean, I don't know if I fully go with this, but the fact that Moldbug thinks that this stinks, he's right. So I'll just give it to Moldbug. He has the correct intuition on this issue right here.
Yeah.
If we abandon these kinds of ethical claims for property right, we are left with the property as a principle of social engineering. What is and how can it be used? Oh, dude! So now we know that Moldbug is a social contractarian. Everything's a social contract, bro. Even property. It's just, I guess, a good social contract.
Mm-hmm.
Property is any stable structure of monopoly control. You own something if you alone control it. Your control is stable if no one else will take it away from you. This control may be assured by your own powers or violence, or it may be delegated by a higher power. If the former, it is a secondary property. If the latter, it is a primary or sovereign property. Well, I don't know if Moldbug is going to say this, but I'll say it. This right here is basically the definition you'll get from libertarians. So, first of all, what is a monopoly? Well, no, monopoly legally is an exclusive right to a resource. Okay, what is property? Exclusive right to whatever you have a title to. So, how is the definition of monopoly and the definition of property not the same thing?
Yeah.
And if it is the same thing, how can libertarians be against monopoly? Second of all, how can a free market libertarian society not necessarily lead to monopoly?
Yep.
I mean, this is, I don't even know. If the structure of property is stable and all transfers are voluntary exchanges, there's no praxeological distinction between primary and secondary property. Oh, wait, let's back this up. If you own it outright, that's a primary property. If you own it because somebody gave it to you, it's a secondary property. If the structure of property is stable and all transfers are voluntary exchanges, there is no praxeological distinction between primary and secondary property. If it is impossible for an aggressor to profit by unilaterally adjusting property rights in her favor, it does not matter why it is impossible. The aggressor could be prevented because her action is physically impractical, because it will be reversed by a police authority, because it will be punished by nuclear strike, etc., etc. The important distinction is between a system in which aggression occurs and a system in which no aggression occurs. The mean is unimportant. I don't know. I mean, I think that given his definition of primary and secondary properties, that distinction would still be meaningful under praxeology, because you could imagine somebody that lawfully homesteaded a bunch of land, too much land for him to actually really govern. He's a neo-reactionary and thinks he's like some reincarnated prince of old Europe, and then doles out fiefdoms to his friends. Like, how is that still not consistent with praxeology? Because it is. I just don't buy this.
Yeah. I never understood praxeology anyway. It just sounds like a made-up stupid word.
Logos actually is the science of acting. It's a science, bro. It's the science of how you act.
That's just economics. Economics is just the study of decision making. What is praxeology independent of economics? This is stupid.
But no, Logos, you forgot. This is an a priori science.
There's no such thing as an a priori science.
I know.
Sorry.
Tell that to libertarians.
No.
Dude, this is a rough article, Logos. Who do we dunk on more, Moldbug or libertarians?
Let them fight.
I'll let them fight. The principle of formalism, which is my own private libertarian heresy, suggests that the purpose of property is to prevent violence. Whoa! Third redefinition, Logos. First formalism is just to tell us what things are and just who owns it. So we're done. And now it's... Then it was shifted to keeping promises. And now it's to prevent violence.
Yes.
I love it. The formalist is completely unconcerned with the moral legitimacy of property rights. She is entirely concerned with their stability. To a formalist, a system in which no involuntary property transfers occur is always ideal at both the primary and secondary levels. Well, I mean, if that's all he cares about, then Moldbug should just be some sort of like Hindu who advocates for the caste system where the Brahmins are at the top. That system has been stable for millennia.
Yeah, I mean, his third definition of formalism is actually pretty consistent with his first one. His second one sticks out like a sore thumb, is obviously watered down for the new readers reading his Dawkins threads. But I can at least see how the first two...
the first and this third one can have some commonality.
Yeah.
Okay. Obviously, the distribution of property affects many people in meaningful ways. An ethical preference for a more egalitarian distribution is certainly valid. Okay, that is a complete reversal of his position in the formalist essay. He said egalitarian distribution was completely invalid because it was incoherent, remember?
Wait, what is incoherent?
And he says right here, an ethical preference for more egalitarian distributions is certainly valid. That directly contradicts his formalism essay, where he attacked egalitarianism as an irrational construct. And then you had to steelman some of the egalitarian arguments about distribution.
Yeah. Well, it's valid as an ethical preference. He just thinks it's an irrational metaphysical preference. It's valid. It's just irrational.
But no, valid means you have an argument with true premises and a true and a formally
validity applied to arguments means that, but obviously an ethical position isn't an argument, Todd. Come on.
But you can't have. But ethical preferences don't matter though. So what gives?
Well, he's about to say it. However,
this goal can only be achieved at the expense of violence, especially if equalization is a continuous process rather than a one-time redistribution. Since most people who consider equalization ethical also seem to express an even stronger aversion to violence, the moral contradiction is theirs to resolve. Oh, okay. I finally see something here, Logos. Okay.
What?
So notice how he always objects to the progressives who want to change the system because it would lead to more violence.
Yeah.
He doesn't quite say this, But his opposition to others on the right, specifically the white nationalists, we just read that last week, is on the same grounds. And he really just is a shill for the establishment, because any rightward or leftward change would lead to violence against Washcore.
Well, yeah, the extra 1-2 punch he's throwing at progressives, though, is that they say they have an aversion to violence. The white nationalists don't.
That's
like,
true.
So what?
That is true. That is true. That is true. No, but what I mean is, for people to have ever thought that Moldbug was their guy to the dissidents, when he's actually always been a patsy for the elite, who
Absolutely.
just his entire MO is to tell all the dissidents, hey guys, hey, listen up. Don't be violent. Just let the structures exist as they are.
We'll change them on your behalf eventually. Just wait.
Yes.
Trust the plan.
Trust the plan. The original Trust the Plan, 2007 style.
Yeah.
To a formalist, violence always has two prerequisites: tension and ambiguity. Tension exists when more than one party desires some limited good. This is basically always. So the only way to eliminate violence is to eliminate ambiguity, the condition in which multiple contending parties reach different conclusions about who will prevail in a tussle. Without ambiguity, the loser will concede and the winner will win without a fight. Again, these principles apply at both levels of property, primary and secondary. The problem of eliminating ambiguity in secondary property is the problem of law enforcement. The problem of eliminating ambiguity in primary property is the problem of external security. History shows us that an effective government can solve both of these problems, and an ineffective one can fail at both. For example, in the lifetime of those now living, the number of robberies in Britain has increased by over 2 orders of magnitude. Nevertheless, the borders between Britain and her neighbors have remained stable over the same time period. This indicates an interesting and not uncommon pattern of effective external security and ineffective law enforcement. Perhaps there is a reason for this, but I digress. But I digress. When has that ever been an excuse for Moldbug?
No kidding. This just drives me nuts.
Or
ambiguity. Ambiguity is the reason for violence. No. No. Listen, if I hate you enough, even if I know I'm not going to win, if I make sure I can kill you before I die, it will be worth doing.
Well, given that Moldbug goes out of his way to be ambiguous, that means he really wants to start fires.
Hey, who's the young chimp? Who's the old chimp?
So in the sort of like in the Buddhist Zen koan riddle for Moldbug, we eliminate violence through formalism by making sure that every succession crisis is a bloody chimp fight.
Yes. Come on, we got to figure out who the young chimp is and who the old chimp is. It's the only way. Let them fight.
I love it. This model of property sheds an interesting light on libertarianism, which I believe reflects its dubious revolutionary ancestry. From the perspective of a formalist, the reason that libertarianism fails is simple. It fails because libertarianism is an anti-proprietarian ideology, and all anti-proprietarian ideologies fail. Socialism is the classic anti-proprietarian ideology. Socialists believe the systems of property in which they are very rich and others are very poor are ethically illegitimate. So they advocate forcible redistribution to correct this injustice. Libertarians and neocapitalists, well, they ascribe unquestionable spiritual validity to the existing distribution of secondary property, completely reject the existing distribution of primary property. True. So primary property is the state who gave it all out to people, which they don't like. Secondary property is people that hold titles on their own. In fact, a true neocapitalist rejects even the case of primary property, strange though this may seem. In its place, there's almost mystic idea of self-enforcing law that strikes me as quite unjustified by reality. The libertarian revolutionaries of the 1770s, using the Lockean theory of homesteading that Rothbard inherits, believed that only those who worked land could truly own it.
Wow, that's also pretty socialist too.
I know. Maybe that's why Locke is sort of falling out of favor.
Yep.
The British Crown and its loyalist followers essentially believe the Crown exercised primary sovereign ownership over the American colonies. Although complications of British history perhaps prevented them from expressing his opinion as clearly today as we might prefer, the question was put to arms and the former prevailed, creating a new distribution of property. Well, you see, that's totally fine, Logos. That just means the young chimp of the American patriots beat the old chimp of the British Empire.
Exactly.
Duh.
Look, I mean, the British Empire was never truly formalist.
Yeah.
It couldn't control the colonies, so that there was ambiguity. The colonies won. That's it.
The U.S. government today has no king. Well, tell BlackRock that, huh, Logos? On the other hand, what?
I said, yeah.
On the other hand, it is certainly a distinct entity, and we can recognize it as a corporation, though it is a virtual person with a single identity. Logos, all modern corporations are virtual persons. What are you talking about?
Yeah.
Under libertarian theory, this corporation is illegitimate since it has no true property right on the land it controls, having never done any farming or tree cutting or whatever. Well, that's not the only way to acquire property. You can also buy it. You could assume the government bought it.
Yep.
And I think in some cases it did buy a lot of land.
It did.
Any fees it charges are no more than extortion and stationary banditry. Under formalist theory, this corporation, which here at UR we call Washcorp, is a normal primary or sovereign property holder. Washcorp is thus a sovereign corporation or a Sovcorp. Its primary ownership of its swath of North America, which to avoid confusion with all political entities we call Hobbit land, is an absolutely normal relationship. The validity of Washcorp's ownership of Hobbit land does not depend on the Constitution, the last elections, or any other magical right, but simply on the stable and exclusive military control it exercises over the territory. As for the fees that Hobbit landers pay to Washcorp, they are normal cost of property rental. Well, I mean, it's interesting that actually Moldbug would be agreeing with the socialist here and arguing that rent is taxes or indistinguishable from taxes. So he's sort of like the libertarians would say rent is fine, but tax is theft. The left would say, the anarchists would say taxation and rent are theft. And Moldbug is like, well, they're both okay.
They're both basically the same thing.
Yeah. Oh, my preference as a resident of Hobbit land is for simple libertarian minarchist government. But wait, he's not a plainlander. He's not a hobbit. He says he's a dark elf. What's up with that, Logos?
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Hobbit land dark elf. What is that supposed to mean?
Mm-hmm.
I noticed that Washcorp does not provide this service. My question is, why not? Note how distant this engineering approach is from Rothbardian ethical libertarianism. We treat liberty as a goal rather than an ideal. We ask, how can we design a system that will achieve this goal and maintain it sustainably?
It doesn't even do that.
No. The puzzle is that Washcorp has every incentive to provide libertarian government, except, of course, for the usual libertarian idea of low taxes. Revenue maximization is Washcorp's bread and butter, as with most primary property owners in history. Like all corporations, Washcorp's financial goal must be to maximize the value of its equity, its property. Because violations of liberty, except in as much as they are necessary to secure Washcorp's ownership of plainland against its residents, hardly an onerous task with modern military technology. Wow! Tell that to the Afghan veterans, huh, Logos?
Yep.
Heck, tell that to the Vietnam vets. Hardly onerous, Logos. Hardly. Do not profit Washcorp, since by definition they conflict with the desires of its residents. They reduce the demand for secondary rights to Washcorp's property and thus reduce its equity value, i.e. stock price. For example, one component of libertarian government is absolute freedom of medicine, or AFM. Under AFM, you, or if you are incompetent, your guardian has absolute control of your own body, what chemicals you put in it, what experts or so-called experts you consult to advise you on maintaining it, etc., etc., etc. Washcorp certainly does not provide the service. The puzzle is why not? Oh, well, that's clear, Logos. Because it's profitable. Washcorp has determined what you can do with your body because it can profit. There's certain social legal norms that, if we're to be allowed, would allow you to slip out of the cash nexus so you wouldn't make money for them. Any prohibition is equivalent to a prohibitively high tax, so high that no one chooses to pay it. Washcorp can thus increase its revenue by reducing the tax, allowing you AFM if you pay the AFM tax. Needless to say, no such proposals on the Washcorp policy menu. The inescapable conclusion is that Washcorp is a very, very badly mismanaged Sovcorp. This is not at all surprising because its management structures bear no relation to any of the very successful designs we use in our normal secondary corporations. Yeah, Logos, so successful that they crashed the economy 1 year later and had to be bailed out by Sovcorp.
Mm-hmm.
Huh. What do you know, huh?
Mm-hmm.
For example, WatchCore has no discernible shareholders. Instead, it appears to be run for the benefit of its employees. The 1990s in the Soviet Union. Doesn't he mean 80s? Because they only lasted 1 year into the 1990s. Many examples of what happens when a large company, especially one that controls a monopoly, is run by and for its employees. The result is corruption, feather bedding, and patronage bloat. These phenomena will certainly be. Wow, Logos! Good thing Apple doesn't have corruption, feather bedding, and patronage bloat. Wow.
Or Disney.
Wow. Good thing that doesn't happen, huh, Logos?
Yeah.
This phenomena will certainly be different in Softcore, at least in detail, but the basic syndrome is really quite recognizable. Corporations controlled by their employees do not produce good customer service as a general rule because they have no capacity for unitary financial managerial planning. If the customer is king, he is king only because his decisions are felt by the CFO, and the CFO is king. To put it differently, employees, unlike shareholders, have no local incentive to steward the quality of the entire operation. Thus, they feel no compunction in abusing customers for their own personal jollies, like an Aeroflot stewardess in the days of yore. And this is how formalism leads us to neocameralism. Neocameralism is the idea that a sovereign state or primary corporation is not organizationally distinct from a secondary or private corporation. Thus, we can achieve good management and thus libertarian government by converting Sovcores to the same management design that works well in today's private sector, the joint stock corporation. Well, here's the thing. That isn't libertarian government, right? I mean, okay. You and I have predicted that if an actual libertarian society were to take place, it would look like the East India Company. But that's not what they say they want. What they say they want is something very different from what Moldbug is articulating.
Right.
And he's done a little bait and switch where he's like redefined the term libertarian. And I think that's why he got so many libertarians to join his side.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
One way to approach neocameralism is to see it as a refinement of royalism, an ancient system in which softcore is a sort of family business. You mentioned that earlier, Logos.
Yep.
Under neocameralism, the biological quirks of royalism are eliminated and the state goes public, hiring the best executives, regardless of their bloodline or even nationality. Or you could just say neocameralism was part of the usual capitalist pattern in which services are optimized by aligning the interests of the service provider and the service customer. If this works for groceries, why shouldn't it work for government? I have a hard time in accepting the possibility that democratic constitutionalism would generate either lower prices or better production in a safe way, although it is certainly fun to imagine the elections. If it strikes you as far-fetched to imagine the U.S. government as a corporation with a stock symbol, you might find it easier to start by thinking in terms of private city-states. While none of them comes anywhere near the neo-cameralist ideal, the city-states of Singapore, Dubai, and Hong Kong certainly provide a very high quality of customer service. Note that none of them has any concept of constitutional, limited, or democratic government. An easy thought experiment for comparing forms of government is to imagine two competing side-by-side cities with identical geography, A and B, in which anyone can migrate from A to B or to B to A by mutual consent of migrant and destination. A common objection to neocameralism is the suggestion that a well-managed softcore might restrict not immigration, but emigration, converting itself into a sort of large open-air prison or slave camp. I invite the reader to imagine the effect that this decision might have on property values, or to think about how profitable it has been proven for South Korea can be or be. Well, too bad somebody didn't read about the barbed wire watchtower prison camps run by American firms in West Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
Huh. Almost like we already tried that, Logos.
Almost.
And it kind of worked until FDR stepped in.
Yep.
We could reasonably say that A has achieved better government than B if there is a net migration flow from B to A, especially if the kind of people who are flowing from B to A are the same kind of people as whoever decides what better means. Now imagine that A and B are both copies of San Francisco, but A is managed by Donald Trump, or Lee Kuan Yew or Elizabeth I, whereas B is managed by a president arrangement of city-state. Logos! We had Donald Trump running Sovcor. What did he say?
I don't know.
No, we just read it with the Hobbit stuff.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
What the heck, Logos? What the heck?
Yep.
We have a real-time test of what he's saying, and
Well, Donald Trump didn't run Softcore, okay? Because Softcore isn't reformed enough that the executive actually gets to run it.
The results, whereas B is managed by president arrangement of city, state, and federal governments. Results, well, SF is a beautiful city, so is Detroit. Well, no, actually, IRL, he chose B over A. He chose B over Donald Trump.
Yep.
Wow, that's amazing. Oh, man.
I also love how they're comparing San Francisco to Detroit. Like, Detroit's a massive victim of globalization. It's not even a fair comparison.
No, Logos, that's good. That's just, softcore doing softcore stuff.
Obviously.
Peaceful people doing peaceful people stuff. You dirty, violence-loving socialist. Note that this hypothesis is entirely testable. It is perfectly practical to create private cities. The step from special economic zones, which are often new cities, see, for example, Saudi Arabia's forthcoming entry in the game, to softcore is quite short. Again, once property rights are stabilized, the difference between primary and secondary government are organizationally irrelevant. Government is management, good government is good management, and bad government is bad management. In conclusion, let's compare formalist neocameralism to libertarianism. Why not? Let's. The advantage of libertarianism from a practical political perspective is it has deep roots in the American value system, and it's hypothetically possible to persuade American voters to return to the values that their ancestors held in the 18th century. If they do this, they will become libertarians, vote for Ron Paul, return us to the gold standard, etc. The disadvantage of libertarianism if I am right, that it is unsound as a principle of political engineering, that its historical roots are largely mythological and fantastic, and that there is no reason to think it is easy to change anyone's value system, let alone resurrect values held by distant ancestors. The disadvantage of neocameralism is that it's completely alien to American voters, that it has no connection at all to any American value system. Logos, I remember this was the argument he had against white nationalists.
Yeah.
Huh. Oh, and this one too. What do you know? That no one has ever heard of it, that it represents a complete rejection of the sacred American principle of democracy, and can be described as not utterly without a grain of truth as corporate fascism or... But apparently now he's mad at Ben Burgess and Matt McManus.
Wow. Wow. Oh, man.
Okay. Oh, don't you just love it? Or some such epithet. The advantage of neocameralism is, if I am right, that unless you have a very persuasive ethical system that glorifies violence, it can be justified logically in a few pages of text without reference to any human ought. It can be tested empirically, and arguably it already has been. In other words, neocameralism has no advantage except that it is a value-free proposition which is consistent with reality. There you go, Logos, a value-free proposition which is consistent with reality.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, BTFO'd, right? Often, historically, this has been sufficient. One way to illustrate neocameralism is to outline a strategy for restructuring WashCore as an efficient shareholder-owned operation. I am aware that I have promised an answer to this question before. Yes, you have. However, this post is far too long already, perhaps next week. Of course, on my vacation, I produced no email whatsoever, but I will rectify this shortly, I swear. I don't think we're ever going to get that answer, are we, Logos?
No.
But remember, guys, I'm not a fascist. Meanwhile, 2007.
Yeah.
This is way too long to start, so we're not going to do this. So, again, far be it from me to steelman the libertarians, but Moldbug didn't see anything of relevance to libertarianism.
No, it's kind of like when Moldbug tried to attack Dawkins, and he ended up not saying a whole lot relevant to Dawkins.
True. All right, guys. All right. I need to tell you how much we have left of 2007. We're almost done with 2007 logos. We're getting close. Let's see here. Okay, why I'm not a libertarian. Okay, now I don't know how long these are, logos, but we just have 4 more articles for 2007, including what's up next.
Say that again. We have how many?
4 more to finish 2007.
Yay! Yeah, when we finish 2007, we gotta do like a year in review episode.
We will. We will. So I don't know. Is there anything else you want to say, logos?
No, that thing tired me out.
I'm exhausted. So Logos is confused and I'm exhausted. So this is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.